welcome to the event. I mentioned earlier, this is the USD Just Read event. It's Fighting for Housing in conversation with Conor Doherty, who's the author of Golden Gates, and just a little bit about the USD Just Read program, of which this event is a part of. And if you haven't heard of USD Just Read, it's USD's Common Read program. And so basically every year, campus collaborators, a concert of campus collaborators come together and choose a book based off of a social justice theme that is chosen by the Changemaker Hub. And so this year it was, the Changemaker theme was on addressing homelessness. And we had a lot of different insight and options for books, and Golden Gates kept coming up in conversation and was talked about as a really great option to read and learn a little bit more about this complex topic. And so we have multiple campus collaborators that work with us to be able to put these events together. You can see the full list on our website, which I'll drop our website in the chat. But a couple that I'll just name would be the Urgent Challenges Collective, because this event is also a part of their Action Week that's happening this week. And so I'll also drop their link in the chat as well, so you can take a look at some of the other events. We'll have an event survey at the end of this event too, just to kind of get your thoughts on, feedback for the event. But I'm really happy to announce and to be able to welcome our two panelists, I guess I can say, but Matt Zolinsky, he's the director for USD Center for Ethics, Economics, and Public Policy on campus, and he's hosted many events for USD and has done a really great job in moderating, and I'm really excited that he is going to be doing it and not myself. But we also have Conor Doherty here with us, who is the author of Golden Gates, Fighting for Housing in America, and he's an economics and housing reporter at the New York Times, which is based in San Francisco. He's actually originally from the Bay Area and grew up in San Francisco and Napa. He took a circuitous route to journalism at one point, and he majored in chemistry at our rival UC San Diego, and teaching and doing so taught high school math in Berkeley before getting his job as a researcher at the Los Angeles Business Journal in 2000. He then made his way up to reporter and worked for the San Diego Union Tribune and the Wall Street Journal before joining the Times in 2014. So without further ado, just kind of the layout for the event today is that we're going to be doing a moderated discussion, or a moderated Q&A, which Matt will be facilitating. There were some questions that we asked folks to be able to prepare, and so you'll be hearing that, but at the last 15 minutes, you will get a chance to ask any additional questions that might come up based off of the conversation that you're hearing. So without further ado, thank you, Matt, and thanks, Conor.
Thanks, Taria, for organizing this event, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to moderate it. I got to say, I jumped on this opportunity as soon as I thought it might be a possibility, because I read Conor's book over the summer and really was just fascinated by it. I'd never really thought about housing as an issue before, except of course to complain about how much housing costs here in San Diego, but I'd never realized just how deep this issue went and how connected it was to so many other issues that I cared about. And so this book was a real eye-opener for me. I've been absolutely enthralled with the issue ever since, and so it's an honor and a real joy to be able to talk with Conor today. So I've got a number of questions of my own. Some questions have been submitted in advance that I'm going to ask Conor here for about the first 40 minutes or so of this event. But if those of you who are in attendance have questions of your own, please just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit those questions. I'll keep my eye on those as we go along, and either kind of interject them in the early part of our discussion, or at the very least, we'll try to reserve the last 15 minutes or so to get to questions that haven't been addressed in one way or another yet. So let me just start off by asking you this question, Conor. So you've written a book about fighting for housing in America, a lot of which, though, is focused really on California and the housing crisis as it's manifested itself here. So I wonder if you could talk about why you did that, other than the fact that you grew up here and you live here. But do you think the housing crisis is particularly bad in California? And if so, what explains that? Is it just that a lot of people want to live here because it's really beautiful and we've got nice beaches, or are there deeper causes having more to do with the political system, the economic system that we have here in California, or is it just as bad everywhere and we haven't realized it yet?
So thanks again for having me, and thank you both of you who I've gotten to know over the Zoom, and thank you USD, where I've spent a lot of time. I think I got a couple tickets skateboarding there back in the day, so I have a relationship with their law enforcement. And anyway, so thank you. I'm going to start by saying there's a kind of I hesitate to call it a formula, but kind of a way you do stories for a national newspaper. As you were saying, in my career, I started off at a hyper-local newspaper of 20,000 circulation in LA, and then I went to the San Diego Union Tribune, and then I went to the Wall Street Journal, and now the New York Times. And how you do a story and how you think about a story is always different in each of those places, because, in the local journalism, you're looking for the real local angle, sometimes taking the national angle and making it local. I remember after 9/11, I was at the Union Tribune not too long after that. A number of the hijackers did have connections to San Diego, and so we do stories on that. But when you're doing a national story, one of the techniques, again, I hesitate to call it a formula, is you try to find an issue of some national importance, and then you try to find a place or some story, geographically based or personality based or whatever, that really, or narratively based, that really kind of captures the issue in a way that speaks to a broader experience, but also brings you into a real narrative. I can think of a million examples. Sometimes it's one doctor's office to tell you about insurance rates. Sometimes it's one street to tell you about congestion, or we could go on and on and on. So I've always used that model, for a whole diverse range of different kinds of stories. And to some extent, and when you pick the example, you're looking for one that really encapsulates the whole issue, and makes for a great story. When I applied, what's wrong with housing in America, I thought a couple of things. One, it often has to do with these hyper-local kind of elections, hyper-local governance, which is true everywhere, but you want to find a place to sort of see how it works. And then also, California is a little bit further along in its disaster, if you will. And so it gives us an opportunity not just to see the housing problem, in a kind of amped up way where you just really have a great, vivid story. It also just gives us a little bit of a better lens through which we can kind of see the future of other places. Because, we do have, we're legislatively, I wouldn't say we're ahead. Minneapolis and other places have passed bills to kind of change single family zoning. Oregon, same thing. But in terms of the state size, it's how far along it is in politics, how aware voters are of the problem. Homelessness in a recent survey was the number one issue on the minds of, now it's climate change, but up until the fires, it was homelessness. So I think California was a vehicle to tell the story in just the sort of natural, normal way you try to tell the story, through characters and through a space. But I also think it was the right choice because it allows us to sort of see around the corner a little tiny bit. And if you're in a place like Minneapolis or, Nashville, places like Seattle and are pretty, kind of satellites of San Francisco and Los Angeles. But I think that if we want to see this problem nationally, California gives us a good, like I said, a good look around the corner. I just did a conference, not terribly different from this one, with a group of people in Columbus, Ohio, and they, all the same things, but you could tell it was just like the same basic pressures, but you could tell they were just like a little less. And so consequently, they had more time to kind of try to get ahead of it a little bit, but also had more opportunity because their problems aren't as severe.
So tell us a little bit more about what the problem is, because I think, again, a lot of us have this personal connection to the housing crisis, and that, we see just how hard it is to afford a house, how long we're going to have to work before we're able to actually, support ourselves and our family in a house, or how hard it is to move into California. But again, one of the really surprising aspects of your book was just how much this housing issue tied into other broader social issues in, for me, again, a really surprising way. I mean, issues about educational access, issues about racial segregation, even, as you mentioned, climate change is not disconnected from this housing issue.
Oh, it's totally connected to it.
So I'd love, can you just talk about some of that? Because I think it might be surprising to some of our audience as well.
Yeah, well, so there's two questions there. One is what the problem is. And then the other is kind of how's it connected to things, right? And if you think about it, it's connected to everything. Everything happens in space. Not to get like philosophical or whatever, but things don't happen nowhere, right? There's no other dimension that we're kind of operating in that is spaceless, right? If you want to live somewhere, if you want to, things exist in places, and humans congregate in places to have community, to have economy, to have, everything happens in a place. And this is, by the way, why you often see land use as a means of regulating all sorts of other things. I think where there was a big fight over the Canadian pipeline, and there have been, of course, fights over Trump's border wall, and a lot of those manifest as like environmental fights and stuff, because it's like if somebody doesn't agree with that policy, they can just regulate the land on which the thing is supposed to go. So the ways in which we regulate land are often a proxy for our social desires, to some extent always are, right? So at the highest possible level, if you have a problem with school segregation, that is often highly connected to who can live near or in what school district. If you are wanting to reduce vehicle miles, car commuting, where you put jobs versus where you put housing is fundamental to that. If you want to encourage transit use, building along those transit corridors is, you guys have the coaster train there, but which is a lovely train, but there's not that much by it. You'll meet people who take that train and you listen to their lives and they sound like so not San Diego. They're like, oh yeah, I just, I go right downtown, I take the train, but there is this small group of people who do that, but because it's not very dense along most of those stations, it's a really small number of people. So everything happens. And so housing is connected. Everything happens in space. So housing is connected to everything. I guess the problem, I would say, in a nutshell, is that we don't have enough housing, period. And we don't have enough affordable housing that reflects the workforce we have. So the American economy has become, this has obviously been talked a lot about, bifurcated into kind of a more have and have not is the way people put it, but the way it plays out is you have a lot of higher end jobs that tend to be connected to some sort of intellectual industry. San Diego has obviously led the nation in biotech, and so you have a lot of scientists running around there, and you have people who work at Qualcomm, and those are kind of the winners of the new economy. And then we have this large service sector, often made up of people who perform some kind of in-touch service, whether it's retail clerks or cleaning people's homes or whatever. And that is on the I hesitate to say the loser end of it, but those jobs do not have the same kind of wage growth, right? So that's what our economy looks like. We'll probably spend the rest of our lives grappling with that problem and trying to correct it through things like better education and minimum wage, all the things, right? But our housing market does not at all reflect that that's how our cities operate. We all sort of know, we all intellectually get that, the person who has a giant house is going to not live in the same neighborhood as the person who comes over to clean that house. But we all also know that the person who cleans the house has to live somewhere near there. They can't live 400 miles away or something, they're right. And so what we've failed to do is allow our housing market to adapt to this world. And by doing that, we've made the lives of people in these lower end professions so much harder than they already are, by forcing them into longer commutes, by removing options. The people who have less money obviously have tremendously fewer options to decide where they want to live. And of course the punishing burden of rents, which is just a reflection of there not being enough housing. So I think, that's the problem. How do we solve that? I think we solve that by loosening up a little bit on our housing regulation. When I say loosening up, I don't mean allowing people to build totally unsafe homes. I don't mean, giving the whole world over to developers and investors. But I do mean allowing neighborhoods to kind of be more flexible in where and how they accommodate new building, or even subdividing homes and things like that. And so I think that my vision, I guess, is that we could have neighborhoods with more, not just more housing, but more housing types, where it's not that weird to see a triplex or a small apartment building next to a single family home. I want to just take one moment and then we can move on. This is not a weird radical vision that I've just laid out. The way that the political discourse in California has been is, oh my God, our neighborhoods will be destroyed and this is the end of California as we know it, and all this sort of thing. But if you go around San Diego, or through some of the older neighborhoods of San Diego, or even in parts of La Jolla, all throughout your community, all throughout my community in the Bay Area, all throughout every American city, and certainly every world city, you will see that the older neighborhoods that were built, many, many decades ago have this tremendous mix of things. Around, Balboa Park and US, you'll see all sorts of single family homes, but then kind of older apartment buildings just fluidly mixed into the neighborhoods. Here's an example I always give people. So just what I was going to say is just drive around. You can see it's not that weird. That people clearly did this at a time, right? I'll leave you with an image that from my neck of the woods, but one that I think really kind of shows us. Everyone can go Google this right now. There's an image everybody's seen, people around the world have seen on a postcard, and it's the image of the Painted Ladies, which is this row of 6 or 7 homes on Alamo Square in San Francisco. And it was the opening of the show Full House. And it's these, do you know what I'm talking about? And it's these lovely homes on a hill, and behind it is the San Francisco skyline. And it's, it's a beautiful picture. If you go there and look at that at that picture in real life, there's a 6 or 7 story apartment building butting up against the uppermost home in the one at the top of the hill, right? And it's this giant apartment building. It's an old apartment building. You can tell, from what it looks like, right? And that's what that neighborhood actually looks like. It looks like single family homes mixed in with larger apartment. Usually the apartment buildings are on the corner, right? And so I think that all we're really talking about when we talk about allowing more housing types and allowing duplexes and triplexes and small apartment buildings is just going back to how we built cities when they were in their growth spur, when they were becoming the lovely functional cities that we now know. And clearly people like this. I mean, I used to live in South Park back when it was pretty transitional, say. And now that's become like, one of the hottest neighborhoods in San Diego. And you can see walking around that neighborhood, people don't know. The sights of small apartment buildings mixed into homes did not freak anyone out. And in fact, it seemed to encourage them.
So the problem is that we don't have enough homes.
And home types.
And home types. And the question is, how do we get here, right? Because I think a lot of people don't really understand the role that land use and zoning restrictions play in creating a situation where we don't have enough homes. So maybe talk a little bit about what regulations there are that restrict us from realizing the kind of vision you're talking about, and how did those regulations come about? If people were so happy back in these mixed use neighborhoods, why did they go away? Why do we end up with what we have?
Yeah, so great question. Returning for a minute to the theme of your first question, which is why did I write so much about California, right? You'll hear a lot about zoning and environmental regulations and land use all these different things, right? And they're all different everywhere, but they often have the same, but they basically have the same effect everywhere. So they're kind of like all different and all the same. Because go to other cities, you can sort of see that single family neighborhoods are like a thing. And they obviously are kind of the predominant housing form in metro areas around the country. So obviously, all these very different regulations kind of end up in the same place. So the reason I bring it up that way is I'm going to talk about this like generally, but that the net effect, but that the specific regulations in your particular place might be different. So zoning, going way back hundreds of years, probably thousands of years, is a very rational creation, right? You can go back and look at, archaeologists will show you, sort of maps and renderings of ancient cities. And even if there's no specific regulations or whatever, there's obviously a custom or a culture that is sort of, encouraging people to build in certain places. Animals don't go next to people. That's clearly a rule that people have observed for many thousands of years for sanitary, and other reasons. As we moved into a more industrial era, people, industries that put out a lot of smoke or a lot of waste, let's not put those next to where people live, right? So there's a logic to this, one that, is so well understood. And the more complicated our society has gotten and the more different kinds of uses we have, and you introduce cars and other types of things into the program, the more regulations we get, the more rules we get. Single-family zoning began somewhere around the 20s, and possibly before it started to proliferate around then. And one of the reasons was that real estate developers, who now of course hate it, loved it because it gives people a sense of security as to, and therefore makes them much more confident about making a tremendously large purchase, as anybody who's gone through the terror of buying a home knows. And because they give you this security that your neighborhood will kind of look the same. And the kinds of people who will move in will kind of look the same. And this is a place where your social motivations, your kind of preference motivations and your financial motivations all kind of come together. So it's kind of hard to pull them apart because, do you, are you protective of what gets built around you because you're protecting your investment? Well, sure. But are you protecting it because that's what you like? Well, also sure. But, so it all gets kind of in this way that our homes kind of encapsulate so much about us. These regulations do reflect all those different motivations, and it's hard to yank them apart. And so that became single family zoning. Over time, generally because of this preference, and also because of, ease of building and other things, that became codified into our cities. Not just through regulation, but also the way home builders build homes, the way banks finance homes. Mortgages, as we learned in the last disaster, mortgages are packaged and sold to banks put into these giant, the book, The Big Short, is all about how this went bad, but, they're put into these pools of mortgages that are then sold as securities. And, a primary condition for being able to do that is that the homes kind of look the same and are easy enough to value. But if everything's totally different, you really have like a one-off kind of product that then becomes more difficult to finance and more difficult to sell. So one way or the other, probably based on our preference and our kind of, deep cultural kind of pastoral kind of country, we are a country built with, every book written about the United States every observation about the United States from the earliest colonists is remarking on how much open land there is, right? So our homes have reflected that. But one way or the other, we codified that this thing through banks, through regulation, through preferences, through everything, through how our federal government backs mortgages, has all pushed us towards this single family home kind of ethic. And it's become, and over time that just builds on itself. It starts to just infect us in a way that's just our version of normal. And you can actually observe that in America, home prices for things end up being very different than in places like Europe because people just like different things. It's the same way certain fashions might be different, okay? So that's, at a large level, these zoning rules, I probably jumped a little ahead. They kind of push us towards this single family home thing, but what do they really look like on paper? Well, they say things like how many stories a home can be. They say things like how far it has to be from the curb. That's called setbacks. They say things like how much open space there has to be around it. In some places, it's 2 and 3 acres. They say things like in college towns, in Boulder, for instance, and many other college towns, they have rules on how many unrelated people can live in a home. And so the only way we can create neighborhoods that look as stale as so many of our neighborhoods look is by just absolutely regulating them to oblivion, where you can't build a different kind of house. You can't build a different kind of, you can't decide that if you want to save money, you can get together with 10 different roommates. And I mean, people do that all the time, but it's often illegal. And obviously also unsafe. So there should be like a place between those things. But, so we have all these rules, and these rules have made our neighborhoods look like they do, but also B, they've made it so hard for us to respond to the changing economy because people can't do anything creative or interesting. And, just think about, how I used to, like I said, I used to live in South Park, North Park area, right on the border on 30th and Redwood. And there used to be I would walk to the brunch area down in the heart of South Park. And I remember there was this one kind of weird skinny house near me. And it was obvious like the person who lived there was like an architect, or obviously it was like a very custom home, and you would see cars driving around it, and you could tell everyone went to look at this house. But sort of like implicit in that is like, wow, this is really hard to do. Who would ever build like a weird house? So we've kind of choked off any freedom we have to try new things. And that, one, makes our neighborhoods look less interesting, in my humble opinion. But also, two, it makes it very difficult for us to accommodate new kinds of living arrangements, new kinds of apartments, new kinds of things, in ways that would allow our economy to kind of more fluidly respond to its changes. That's probably a mouthful, but in the end, when I talk about how zoning kind of came up, it came up because people liked single-family homes and developers liked building them. But over time, those regulations became so intent on steering everyone towards that thing, and banks and all these other things layered on top of that, that it became the only thing. And I think that has made us very brittle. It's created a place where we have to have these gigantic legislative conversations to even change our economy. But we don't have to have that for many other things. We don't, different kinds of supermarkets pop up all the time. You see what I'm saying? Like it's made us such a brittle society in terms of how our housing responds to the changes around us. And that makes us less competitive, less good.
So zoning means a lot of different things, right? And as you said, some of it is right.
Generally
some
speaking,
obvious common sense, right? It's you don't want a polluting factory next to your where you live and sleep at night.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes zoning is simply a reflection of the preferences of the people that live in certain areas. Other times, though, it's not as innocent. And I wonder if maybe you could illustrate that by talking about the role that race has played in the development of zoning in America. I mean, this is something that Richard Feldstein talks a lot about in his book, The Color of Law, but it's something that you go into in your book as well. And
yeah, totally. So at some level, zoning often just means what you can do on that land. And as you said, it can be industrial and versus commercial versus residential, but then it can also be single-family residential versus multifamily residential. And as I also just said, it just gets even more complicated than that. How far you back are from the curb and how many stories and everything. There was a big fight in San Francisco recently over monster homes. They were people wanted big homes that people thought were too big for the area. So it does work in reverse sometimes. So up until 1948, America allowed the truly putrid, ugly practice of racial covenants, where similar to homeowners association today, where they say, you can't put billboards on the roof and you have to cut your grass. They would say, no non-white people can live in these developments. And a great many people in California, if they go look up the deed to their home, can still find those covenants in the deed. So even though they're not like obviously legal anymore, they are still attached to so many properties in this state and around the country. The FHA, which is the Federal Housing Administration, which guaranteed many of the mortgages on which suburbanization kind of proliferated, allowed what was called redlining, which is what the color of law is about. And these are basically mortgage guidelines that say, there are about a great many things, but one of the things was that they basically said, you can't sell a home, you cannot give a mortgage to an African-American family in X neighborhoods, right? And so redlining was, the line on which different non-white families were steered. So the reason this is important is, and this is obviously why The Color of Law is such a seminal book, think about what that is. That's a federal policy that is lowering credit prices, essentially giving free money, to one group of people to buy homes, while specifically through federal policy and literally through prices, through more, excluding another family. And not only that one decision can explain a startling amount of our wealth gap between African-American families and white families. Because so much of our wealth since 1945, the end of World War II, has been housing wealth. In fact, if you look at our well-being independent of housing wealth, it actually it does not tell a very nice story. So this one decision, it's when people start talking about reparations and other things, it always comes down to this one. Not this one, but like this is very central to that, because it's something we're still living with, and it's something that people who are alive today, albeit kind of old, are responsible for. And so anyway, so that's the background on redlining. Because we now have such a huge disparity in wealth as well as income between Black and white families, and also, obviously white and Latino as well, the ability to sort of zone your neighborhood for higher income, homes that will inevitably be more money, can now be a proxy for race in a way it might not have been when we were building Levittown and the early suburbs. Remember, the early suburbs, like Levittown, the homes were only 800-900 square feet. And the mortgage cost on them was usually about the cost of a 2-bedroom apartment. So at that time, there was, the wealth differences were not so, the wealth combined with the home prices were not so great that we wouldn't, if we had not had redlining, we might have just had way more diverse neighborhoods very naturally. And the color of law kind of makes these distinctions. What is de facto segregation versus what is de jure, meaning by decree, segregation, right? So because we're now in this world, we almost have to undo that. You almost have to allow, you do have to allow different kinds of housing types that are more, that will allow, that attract a much broader economic spectrum. So that means things like smaller apartments. It means things like smaller condos. It means things like duplexes. But it still means changing the zoning so that you can allow more housing types, like I was saying. And there's all sorts of great reasons for that. I mean, if people live and work in your community, they are part of your, if people work in your community, they are part of your community, your teachers, your retail employees. Not all of them are going to want to live right next to where they work. I worked in Carlsbad when I lived in San Diego, and I liked living in North Park, and that was kind of a far. So, people do make that choice. In my case, it was the reverse choice, but when you kind of like make it so difficult for people to work, live in the community in which they work, you really start to not just pull society apart. You just make the economy less, vibrant, less, people don't have as much of a stake in their community. And so anyway, because we baked in this vast housing inequality, we almost have to unbake it. And that will require a great many things. But one of the main ones is just allowing different housing types in neighborhoods that currently allow only single family homes.
So one of the things I'm glad you're shifting into talking about, what we can do about this, because the dimensions of this problem are so fascinating and complicated. We could spend all day talking about them, but there's a movement, which you spend a lot of time talking about in your book now, that's trying to do something to address this problem. It's the Yimbi movement, right? The Yes in My Backyard movement, formed right in opposition to the more well-known NIMBY, like not in my backyard, build housing somewhere, but not here movement. So tell us a little bit about YIMBYism. There are people in the California state legislature like Scott Wiener who are very much supportive of this movement and who have sponsored bills that have tried to do some of the things that you said we should be doing more of. Those bills have had mixed success. We just had a whole slew of them come up recently, and a lot of them went down in flames. So, what is this movement, and what are its prospects for success in the near term future or the long term future? Especially now that we have a president, right, who's tweeting about how Democrats are waging a war on the suburbs and want to destroy the American way of life.
So I'm happy you asked me this, because housing policy, inevitably, whenever I have a discussion about housing policy, it goes the way the last 40 minutes have gone with me and you. But when you read this book, there's very little of that. The book starts off with this, this woman, Sonia Traus, who shows up to a city council meeting or board of supervisors meeting. We don't have a city council in San Francisco. In shorts, and she drives a orange Crown Victoria, like a cop car that's covered in glitter, and she says all these bombastic things. She many of which I can't say in this program, but and she goes and just starts this, basically raising hell at city meetings. And all these young people, young as in like under 40, who are unhappy about their rent, feel like they'll never get to buy anything, feel like they're just stuck, just start joining her. And they start taking off their lunch meetings and going to, taking off lunch to go to city meetings and protest and speak in favor of new developments. And it was a real huge shift in San Francisco. I mean, if you've ever been to a city meeting, they're pretty dry, and suddenly they're just, these people doing these performances at the microphones. Every year now they have this like little Yimbi Oscars where they give out kind of fake awards. They're like best public comment, and they run these videos of people saying things at public meetings, and they're all crazy. So they've really inserted like not just youth, but also kind of a sense of outrage to this problem. And so then I followed Sonia, so she for quite some time, but then there was like, suddenly there was this national meeting of Yimbys in Boulder. And now there are Yimby groups all around the country. They have these giant conference calls together. They have Julian Castro was supposed to speak, former Secretary of Urban Development, Housing and Urban Development. Julian Castro was supposed to speak at their meeting this year. It was canceled because of COVID. So this giant movement, this like young pro-housing movement kind of just popped up. And the book kind of really charts that and looks at that and talks about the intellectual history, how writers like Matt Iglesias were kind of like pushing it along, and then suddenly it blew up into this thing. So, and how people start a movement is kind of at the center of that story. And it's fascinating to see what sort of puzzle pieces need to go in place. How do you get money? How do you quit your job to become a full-time activist? All these like very practical things kind of come into this. They started getting more legislatively active, and at the time they just glommed on to Scott Wiener, who was like the one person who would encourage them. Everyone else treated them as crazy people, which they kind of were, but and they worked tirelessly to get him elected to the state Senate. He ultimately was elected. And in the course of that, he became this huge champion for housing in the state. And honestly, the nation, all these other states are constantly calling him to ask him about. And so he kind of put together some bills to kind of undo all these zoning restrictions that we just spent all this time talking about. Now you were starting to see this thing go federal, where every Democratic presidential candidate in the last primary cycle had a huge housing plan with zoning as a huge part of it. there wouldn't be national zoning for what it's worth, but they would use federal money in some way to essentially force or at least encourage cities to change their zoning, using the power of the purse to move local regulation in a particular direction. And as you said, and the irony of all this is President Trump literally signed something called the Yimbi Act a couple of years, or about a year ago, and now that he's having these troubles with suburban voters, is trying to completely go full 180 from where he just was, to this new I'm going to like protect single family zoning kind of stance. And so I started following this around 2016. Nothing was happening. Or 2015. And at that time, it felt like when I would write stories, all I would have to talk about would be like all the stuff you and I just talked about, combined with, economics papers saying this is like suboptimal and what, it was just very dry stuff. But right around 2015, 2016, this explosion of interest from politicians, from young people, there's been a huge rent control movement. Housing has not just become important, which it's always been. It's just like, it is exciting people. It is getting people to quit their jobs and become activists. It's getting other people to spend their free time becoming activists. There's all these people running for city council around the Bay Area, around the country. You have a very robust Yimbi movement in San Diego. So this has really become a national thing. And it's become really a place where a lot of young people, it's their first introduction to local politics. In San Francisco, people are like 10 times more passionate about who their board of supervisors person is than even the president. Now, part of that's because the whole city's going to vote. There's no everyone knows which way the city's going to vote on president. So it's like not that interesting. But, and so I think this explosion of interest, okay, so the last legislative session was really bad, as you say. There was all these big ambitious housing bills. The governor declared it was like the year of housing, and then basically nothing happened. And everything that has happened has been pretty middling, right? And I make no predictions about when and how things will change, right? Who knows? It's always like who voted when, and there's all these like year-to-year political things that start to determine how these things go. But it wouldn't be a Zoom call if your baby didn't come into the room. So I am dealing with that right now. But all these bills and all this excitement, I think, points to a cultural shift. And it's a cultural shift in which young people have now, again, under 40, have now come to see housing and, and all these zoning things we talked about as proxies for race, for economic empowerment, for inequality, for all these things we've talked about. And as they absorb that value, I think that will have a huge effect over time. Let me just give you two little examples. There's this whole chapter in my book about this suburb of Lafayette where they wanted to build an apartment complex in a suburb, and of course the rich people nearby got mad. Very stereotypical suburban story. That the whole fight took 9 years, and it just resolved a couple weeks ago. I either watched or attended a great many of the early meetings about that project, and there was literally not one single person besides the developer himself who ever spoke in favor of it in any way. The last two meetings they had before they ultimately approved it, because state law made them, so that was a state law that changed and was consequential. There was all sorts of people from there, older people, younger people, some high school students, all sorts of people speaking in favor of this and tying it to race and class in all the ways that you and I have done. So just the presence of those voices, was a real material change I can point to. And then another thing was just, I get this little newsletter from my little neighborhood association in my neighborhood in Oakland. And there's this little planning committee, for our little neighborhood. And usually nobody runs for this committee. Something like 15 people are running for it now, and they send around their bios to our neighborhood, and it's all these young people being like, I live here and I own a single family home here, but I want other people to have this opportunity, and that means different housing. They're saying all the same things. So that little bubbling up, that feels more important to me long run than any of these top-down type things, because it suggests that there's a new value being absorbed, and how that value translates into law, is TBD. But, if NIMBYism was kind of the original sin, this kind of change towards, we got to be a little bit more open, that cultural shift, I think, will be hugely, hugely, hugely important. And the reason it'll be hugely important is no matter how you change the law, if everyone hates something around them, they're going to find a way to make it. You know what I mean? Like, it will be very difficult to overcome that. So at some level, you just really need people to absorb this value. What kind of world do we want to live in, and what do the decisions about what happens around me, what role do the decisions that happen around me play a role in that? So
that's great.
What role does who lives around me play in a more just, more equitable world?
Yeah. That's terrific. I would love to keep asking my own questions, but I don't want to be too selfish about the way I run this thing. And we do have a number of really excellent questions that have been submitted.
Yes, and I'm happy to stay longer or whatever, Yeah.
Well, awesome. I might hold you to that. Yeah. So let me ask you a question here. This comes from my colleague, Juliana Maxim, who is a professor in the Department of Architecture and Art History. So basically, she wants to challenge you on the build more houses idea, right? So what Juliana says is that there have been several recent studies that show that there are thousands of units that have been held off the market for reasons beyond normal vacancy. She says that non-market vacancy in LA is over 46,000 units. That's more than one for every unhoused person. She says, look, we're building plenty of homes. The problem is we're building them only for the rich. The market prioritizes the construction of high-end homes. The real estate industry and the building industry are behind this build, build view. And the question is whether sort of unleashing these market forces by trimming down on these government regulations is really going to produce this sort of trickle-down effect that provides more houses, not just for the rich, but for everybody else as well.
Mm-hmm. So, great question. As with all things in housing, it's all very complicated, and she brings up great points, and they're all totally valid points, and they don't necessarily have to be in conflict with building more housing, right? It is true. So, Del Mar is a resort community. Some of the people live there. Some of the people who live there because they live there and work in San Diego and are connected to your local economy in some way. But a great many other people live there because it's their second home, and they just want to have a beach home in California. I don't think you can like prohibit Del Mar from being that kind of community. You could pass an empty homes tax, which Vancouver has done. And raises the cost of basically having second and third homes. You can, there are things you can do with that. One thing I want to push back on, though, or not push back on, but one thing I want to add. When we do need more affordable housing, full stop. That means more money for affordable housing, as the state has done, and hopefully the federal government will do. That means reinvestigating public housing, which is, just subsidized housing, but with a different administration. So no different. And, and the state passed rent control, which you could argue about the percentage of it, but passing statewide rent control was a step. It was a big step. So I think those are positive steps to help us get through this crisis. But at some level, when we talk about, quote, the real estate industry, I mean, that's a very big statement. The real estate industry means, union construction workers, which is what pretty much the only job, really good paying job of especially the only unionized, well-paying job that people who didn't go to college can get. it's a really, really important job. It's the kind of middle-class job we say we want and that we've lost with manufacturing, but we still have. So those I mean, most of the revenue in a real estate transaction, I'm sorry, in the building of a building goes to those workers. There's obviously the developer is going to get rich too, but is going to get rich. So you can have a problem with that. But I just meant, there's still this huge mass of people who are employed by building these things. On top of that, we have made it so difficult and expensive to build kind of like little things. There's all sorts of lawsuits against duplexes and things like that. That the only thing that gets built, and I see this all the time in San Francisco, is these mega developments, is these giant, and you talk to, it's funny, I talk to developers about some of the things Scott Wiener's done, and they all poo-poo it. They're like, I don't care about duplexes. They're like, large multifamily is the only way we're going to move the needle. And the reason they say that is that's what they want to build, because that's what they build. That's what they get giant bank loans for. But if you look at, especially you start talking about like minority-owned businesses, that's a lot of those kind of like smaller businesses, the kinds of businesses that people who were carpenters can work their way up to through entrepreneurship. Those are the kinds of people who build, these smaller units, small apartment buildings. I mean, it's a pretty heavy-duty deal to build a giant condo in downtown San Diego. And the people who do it, the big engineering firms and giant, institutional capital behind it, whatever. But like a fairly normal construction company, even just like a guy who knows what he's doing can build like a 2 or 3 story house or apartment building. I'm not saying it's like super easy, but there are a ton of smaller firms that can build those different kinds of kind of like mid-level things that we've basically outlawed and certainly made financially infeasible through, the difficulty of, you can stop a project like that with one lawsuit. Whereas these big apartment buildings, I mean, they'll spend the rest of their lives fighting. They don't care about $10-20 million in lawsuits because they're going to these, because they're building these massive, high profitable, things. Or buildings, right? So I think that it is totally true that we only build at the high end right now, right? But I guess we have to ask ourselves how we let it get that way. And it seems to me it's really difficult to say that not building housing for 40 years, is a big piece of that. It has not ever been true outside some very rare instances that new housing was super cheap. It is our affordable housing in America has almost always come from kind of older housing that has, I hate this term trickle down, but has trickled down in some way, right? And I also think that this term trickle down, though I understand it, it's a reference to trickle down economics, which has to do with like the money supply and Ronald Reagan, right? And I feel that when you're talking about, it just feels like when you're talking about supply and demand of like a good, like a thing we need, it's just a fundamentally different equation than like supply side tax cuts, which we know don't work. And I also think it's important to remember that the kinds of economists are not God, right? But the kinds of economists who are saying we need to build more housing are the same economists who are saying supply side tax cuts, which is the original trickle down economics, is total bogus. So it's not like there's this, cabal of right wing thinkers who are beside, who are, pushing supply side tax cuts as well as, less support, right? So, I mean, I do think that it's a consensus that we really need more housing. I mean, you look at California, it's like I think it's 50th in the it's 49th in the nation for per capita housing construction, right? So the only one that's 50 is Utah, and they do, contrary to what you would stereotype, they do have larger families, and so because it's a heavily Mormon state, and so the construction is actually not as well needed, right? So there's a lot of, and anyway, I could go on and on and on and on, but I do think that what bothers me about this debate is it's typically oppositional. It sort of says we shouldn't do X, we should do Y, when it should be like, we should do all these things. Let me give you a perfect example. Sorry, I'm going on and on and on. In San Francisco right now, they're trying to pass a law that would allow more public housing, or they would allow public housing. There is a law in California called Article 34 that basically you have to have a vote of the people to have truly public housing, right? Now, this is really just an administrative trick. I don't think it's a bad idea, but all it really does is say the city can manage housing. They already build tons of affordable housing, but it's just managed by nonprofits instead of the city, right? Okay. In their sales pitch for this proposition, which I don't have any problem with, it's, having the option to have a public housing, it's like, sure, fine, go for it, right? They say we need to be more like Vienna and other cities that have social housing, right? And that's a perfectly reasonable sales pitch. The thing is, Vienna has I think 2% of its landmass in the city used for single family homes. There's no neighborhood that is single family homes only, right? So when we start emulating these places that we think did housing well, we have this way of doing it in California, in America, where we emulate one of the things, but not all of the things, right? So sure, let's move towards Vienna, but if we're going to move towards that, shouldn't we look at all of the things they do, not just look at them in a vacuum, right? And I think that I don't think we spend enough time asking ourselves how do all these things work together? I mean, on top of all this, and I'll just end with this, building more affordable housing is a great idea. Guess what? Affordable housing is subject to all the same zoning constraints, all the same environmental, problems. This is why there was just a big LA Times article about this that you guys saw. It now costs almost $1 million per unit to build. They just had a big, the LA Times just did a giant, amazing story about an affordable housing development in Encinitas that cost $1 million per unit, right? So if San Diego were to pass, I don't know, a $1 billion affordable housing bond, which for a city would be quite a large number, right? That'd be 1,000 units. So, I mean, I'm all for building more affordable housing, but I just think that we need to recognize that if we don't have land to build it on and it's impossible to build, it's going to be subject to the same constraints as private market, as the so-called rich stuff. So and also the exact same workers build. It's not like there's this whole separate group of people that build affordable housing. So I think that we need to be thinking about this thing in a whole and not, and putting all these solutions together, and thinking about them together. And again, I would just add, when you look at cities like Vienna, that's what they do. So if we really want to emulate them, maybe we should take the whole picture, not just the things that we think we want and hew to our political preferences.
That's terrific. I'm hearing you say there's a lot of different tools we can use to address the housing crisis in California and elsewhere, and we shouldn't view it in this kind of zero-sum way where you have to pick one or the other. One of the tools, and you've been very generous with your time, and the audience has been patient with us here. As I said, I could talk to you about this all day, but I'll ask one more question before we wrap it up, because there's some interest in this in the Q&A.
Yeah.
One of my favorite parts of your book really was the discussion you included of rent control, which I thought was a remarkably balanced and thorough treatment of what's really a pretty complicated and controversial issue. A lot of economists don't like rent control, but you also, while presenting the economist case against it, you also did a pretty good job, I thought, of presenting the case for it. So could you talk just a little bit about rent control before we wrap up?
Yeah. So the intellectual case for rent control is that all right, so the bottom line is this. Rent control is city regulations that say you cannot raise rents above a certain percentage, right? And it can be considerably more complicated than that. But that's the basic gist of it, right? I'll add one layer of complication, which is something called vacancy control, which means that in California, if all sorts of cities in California have rent control, and they say, like, you can only raise it 2 or 3 or 4% a year. But if the tenant leaves, they can raise it as much as they want to market rate. When you hear people talk about vacancy control, they mean that the rent on the unit will be regulated in perpetuity. It does not matter if it's vacated, right? So, and there's a fight right now, or a proposition this year, Proposition 21, that would allow vacancy control. And that, if you hear people talk about Prop 21, that's what they're talking about, right? Economists' case against rent control is basically that it discourages people from building new housing because they don't have a profit motive. And also it discourages people from renovating them and updating them beyond the minimum required by law. And then the third thing, so those first two things, the first thing, it discourages building housing, I don't think is really true. Particularly if you have vacancy decontrol, which we do here. I mean, New York has pretty tough rent control. They build plenty of housing. It is wealthier housing, but whatever. Second thing, they don't renovate them. I don't know. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. I'm sure on the margins that has to be true, right? The thing that is important, though, is it does encourage people to flip them to condos. You see that all the time. I don't think you see that as much in San Diego, although I was living in an apartment in San Diego when they kicked us out to make it a condo. So that certainly happens. So that's one. Here is my take on rent control, though. At a very philosophical level, we have a 30-year fixed mortgage in America. So most people, when they go to a bank and they buy a home, they get a 30-year, what's called a 30-year fixed mortgage, right? Now, you think when you go to the bank that Wells Fargo or whoever, out of the goodness of their heart is giving you this lovely deal, but that's not really true. Through the mortgage giants, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, we have this massive government infrastructure, or government-backed infrastructure, to basically intervene in credit markets to give you a fixed rate mortgage. That is, in effect, an entitlement that there's massive government programs running in the backgrounds to give you. And the reason we do that is we've decided very reasonably that if you have no idea what your mortgage rate, what your house payment is going to be in any given month, it will create huge instability for you. And that only a pretty rich person would then buy a home, because they'd be the only people who would have would have enough money to just be like, have their house payment double 1 month versus another month, or 1 year versus another year, depending on interest rates, right? So, and the reasons we do this is, stability, to, create a market for people. There's all these reasons we as a government have decided to basically give rent control, to give price control to people who buy homes. And it just strikes me that we should not be, if all those things are a great idea for homeowners, go ask a homeowner if they want to open themselves up to interest rate risk. They don't. They try. People, I mean, there's so many people who buy like a 7-year ARM because that's all they can afford, but the second they have a chance to get into a 30-year, they get, so if it's a good idea for homeowners, and it's a good idea to stabilize families and communities and whatever else in a home, why is it such a bad idea? Why is it better to have renters, moving around all the time, pulling their kids in and out of school, right? Now, in the old days, when homes were much cheaper, the idea was that the escape valve for higher rent, like if you tried to raise the rent, if you tried to triple the rent on someone, they would just buy a home, right? I told you at the beginning of this conference, in the early days of Levittown, it was about the cost of a 2-bedroom apartment was what a mortgage cost on a new suburban home, right? So you could only raise rent so far in that world. Today's world, home prices have gone so much higher than rents that's not possible anymore. And so the market isn't really functioning as it was. On top of that is the fact that we're in like an emergency. There's all sorts of people who are made homeless by massive rent increases. I follow one in the book. The family wasn't homeless; they were temporary homeless, but and so I think that I think that some amount of price control is a good idea because we see it works with housing, right? Or ownership housing, but also B, we're in a crazy crisis right now, and just stopping that crisis from getting worse is a good idea. So if you passed like some crazy 0% rent control, yes, nobody would ever build anything again, and we'd have a much worse problem. But I believe there's got to be some place in the middle where, or maybe it's that after 20 years, I think that's what they're starting to do now, these buildings lapse back to rent control, so that you're increasing the stock of rent controlled apartments while not disincentivizing people from building things to begin with. I don't know. I just feel like there's a way that we can fine tune this policy to create a larger stock of secure housing. And we do this with all sorts of other markets. So I gotta believe it can work. Right. So, I guess that's my somewhat nuanced take on rent control. But it's crazy. You look at a place like, just to speak about homelessness for a moment, you look at a place in San Francisco, and this is probably true in San Diego as well. We spend all this money on homeless people who are, on the street, degrading in their health, degrading in their mental health, just really in a bad state. We spend all this money on these on people in that state, as we should, but we spend almost no money on people who are just like one rent increase away from going down that path. If you ever talk to homeless experts about how much money you can solve homelessness for by being just a little bit proactive, it's so little money that it's hard to fathom how we even have a homeless problem. And so rent control or some amount of price protection, and perhaps more importantly, creating that stock over time, through some kind of mixed program, is a way I think we can sort of slowly, hopefully quickly, but then over time, slowly prevent people from just becoming homeless in the first place, which is like not just humane, it's like the cheapest possible way to solve the homeless problem, or to attenuate it. So I think if it's a good idea to have some kind of predictability in your house payment, which we've decided for all sorts of people, it seems like it must be a good idea everywhere.
Well, that is a thoughtful, balanced, and humane answer to that question, and it is reflective of the thoughtful, balanced, and humane approach you take to that issue and many others in this book. For those of you in the audience who haven't read it yet, I really strongly encourage you to do so. It's a fun read. It's an exciting read. It opened my eyes to a lot of different issues, and really made me see the lived-in world around me in a different way. So thank you, Conor, for writing it, and thank you so much for joining us today to talk about this book.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
Yeah, it's been real fun.
Thank you so much, Conor.
Thanks. Bye.
The audience for dropping by. We'll have this recorded, and so those of you who want to go back and watch the conversation again or share it with your friends, you'll be able to do so within a few days.